This is our home. It looks the same as it has done for thousands of years. But if you get a bit closer, you can see we've made a few changes.
We've transformed the planet by exploiting the complex system that produced us. Our ability to control our habitat has resulted in rapid population growth and our dominance as a species. Today, our effects can be seen across 80% of the Earth's landmass.
Our world is becoming a man-made world. Wherever you look, you'll see the scale of this supersized transformation. Our generation is changing the face of the planet as never before, building faster than ever, transforming whole landscapes in the blink of an eye. We're opening up the Earth and conquering the sky, making it a place we can call home. Our ingenuity and ambition has enabled us to move around the planet in previously unimaginable ways. We can travel further and faster than at any point in human history. We've connected the furthest reaches of our globe and made travel easier than ever before. The oceans are now bustling highways filled with thousands of ships carrying cargo across the globe. These new connections have helped create our modern world.
Our machines have transformed the planet. So great is our impact on the Earth that it has been used to define a new geological epoch. The Anthropocene, the human epoch. If you add together all the landscapes we've altered, our cities, towns, villages and farmland, then 75% of the Earth's ice-free landmass owes its appearance to us. This truly is a human planet.
This is the story of how one species changed a planet.
After 180,000 nomadic years, and thanks to a more clement climate, humans settled down. They no longer depended on hunting for survival. They chose to live in wet environments that abounded in fish, game, and wild plants, there where land, water, and life combine. The invention of agriculture turned our history on end. It was less than 10,000 years ago. Agriculture was our first great revolution. It resulted in the first surpluses and gave birth to cities and civilizations. The memory of thousands of years scrabbling for food faded. Having made grain the yeast of life, we multiplied the number of varieties and learned to adapt them to our soils and climates. We're like every species on Earth. Our principal daily concern is to feed ourselves. When the soil is less than generous and the water becomes scarce, we are able to deploy prodigious efforts to extract from the land enough to live on. But after relying on muscle power for so long, humankind found a way to tap into the energy buried deep in the earth.
The latest chapter of our story begins in England 250 years ago. Fueled by coal, then oil, several brilliant inventions appeared. They ignited the Industrial Revolution, which spread like wildfire through Europe, North America, Japan, then elsewhere. The great railways, then cars and highways, connected people across the globe. Medical discoveries saved millions of lives. New artificial fertilizers meant we could feed more people. Population rose rapidly.
America was the first to harness the phenomenal revolutionary power of black gold. In the fields, machines replaced men. A liter of oil generates as much energy as 100 pairs of hands in 24 hours.
While the rise in new machinery robbed some men of their jobs, it created new jobs for others. Mechanics and machine operators were now more in demand than craftsmen. The majority of these new positions were made available in the factories of the nation's largest cities. As New York, Chicago, and Boston grew outward along the railways, a host of previously unskilled laborers were trained to meet the new demand for factory workers. Disillusioned farmers who moved up from the country filled part of the need, as did young men who grew up in the country but dreamed of finding their fortune in the cities. City population swelled as a result. New York's population doubled, and Chicago's population quintupled. Even smaller cities boomed. Los Angeles had only 5,700 citizens in 1870. By 1900, the population was over 102,000. In the same period, the size of Philadelphia nearly doubled. Former country dwellers made up a large part of the new population in the cities. But the flood of immigrants entering the country also made up a large part of the new workforce. People from all parts of Europe were migrating to the United States in record numbers between 1870 and 1900. During the 1880s alone, around 5 million foreigners entered the country. Seeking political freedom and economic prosperity, most had to settle for difficult and dangerous low-paying factory jobs and cramped living quarters in filthy city tenement houses. 60-hour work weeks were not uncommon, and benefits such as pensions or workers' compensation were practically unheard of. As cities grew, the need for new buildings opened up another avenue for employment in construction. For the first time, steel was being used in mass quantities to create the skeletal frames upon which the city's tallest buildings were built. Called skyscrapers, these buildings were often 10 to 20 stories high, and they stood as symbols of power and the achievement of the American dream. But much of that dream was denied to the immigrants, most of whom lived in poverty in the city's slums. The unsanitary living conditions in these neighborhoods led to outbreaks of typhoid and cholera, which spread quickly throughout the overcrowded, poorly ventilated tenement apartments.
But this was nothing compared with what was to come. The 1950s marked the beginning of the Great Acceleration. Globalization, marketing, tourism, and huge investments helped fuel enormous growth. People swarmed to cities, which became even more powerful engines of creativity.
It was called the Atomic Age and the Fabulous 50s. Home builders anticipated the needs of newlyweds and young families. They built new suburbs that appealed to countless first-time homebuyers. Eager families left urban areas in droves to enjoy modern homes with the latest time-saving conveniences. It was exactly what many young families wanted: a neat, affordable place to live. $90 down and $58 a month could buy a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house with modern amenities, well within reach of the new middle class.
In a single lifetime, the well-being of millions has improved beyond measure. Health, wealth, security, longevity. Never have so many had so much. Yet 1 billion are malnourished.
In the United States, only 3 million farmers are left. They produce enough grain to feed 2 billion people. But most of that grain is not used to feed people. Here, and in all other industrialized nations, it's transformed into livestock feed, or biofuels. The pocket of sunshine's energy chased away the specter of drought that stalked farmland. No spring escapes the demands of agriculture, which accounts for 70% of humanity's water consumption. In nature, everything is linked. The expansion of cultivated land and single-crop farming encouraged the development of parasites. Pesticides, another gift of the petrochemical revolution, exterminated them. Bad harvests and famine became a distant memory. The biggest headache now was what to do with the surpluses engendered by modern agriculture. But toxic pesticides seeped into the air, soil, plants, animals, rivers, and oceans. They penetrated the heart of cells similar to the mother cell that is shared by all forms of life. Are they harmful to the humans that they released from hunger? These farmers, in their yellow protective suits, probably have a good idea. Then came fertilizers, another petrochemical discovery. They produced unprecedented results on plots of land thus far ignored. Crops adapted to soils and climates gave way to the most productive varieties and the easiest to transport. And so, in the last century, 3/4 of the varieties developed by farmers over thousands of years have been wiped out. As far as the eye can see, fertilizer below, plastic on top. The greenhouses of Almeria in Spain are Europe's vegetable garden. A city of uniformly sized vegetables waits every day for the hundreds of trucks that will take them to the continent's supermarkets.
Aral Sea, which at one time was the 4th largest lake in the world. But the diversion of water from the rivers for cotton irrigation has caused it to dry up.
Poor irrigation has resulted in the loss of approximately 900 cubic kilometers of the Aral Sea.
By the 1980s, water feeding into the Aral Sea had become so scarce that the sea was evaporating away. The sea's water level dropped more than 50 feet by 1989. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, regional governments tried to conserve water and forestall the demise of the sea. But their efforts were poorly coordinated, and so by 2000, the sea level declined by a total of 125 feet. The shoreline narrowed considerably, as seen in this satellite imagery. The sea divided first into smaller pools, then narrow lakes, the northern Aral Sea and the southern Aral Sea. They were over 3 times as salty as the original water. Fish and other life died off. Isolated islands in the sea that were once secure sites for Soviet germ warfare tests became vulnerable to land access as water evaporated away. Salt and industrial chemicals once dissolved in the water were carried as dust to the land, causing disease.
Soil is a mixture of minerals from broken down rocks and nutrients from organic matter. It takes more than 500 years to create just 2 centimeters of it. In China, deforestation and overgrazing means soils are being degraded 30 times faster than the planet's natural processes can replenish them. In Australia, clearing large areas of bush for farmland has allowed salt to infiltrate the topsoil, damaging around 60,000 square kilometers.
In some parts of Madagascar, the erosion is spectacular. Whole hillsides bear deep gashes hundreds of meters wide. Thin and fragile, soil is made by living matter. With erosion, the fine layer of humus, which took thousands of years to form, disappears. On the hills of Haiti, only 2% of the forests are left. Stripped bare, nothing holds the soils back. The rainwater washes them down the hillsides as far as the sea. What's left is increasingly unsuitable for agriculture. Once the pearl of the Caribbean, Haiti can no longer feed its population without foreign aid. Charcoal is one of the population's main consumables. Over 2 billion people, almost a third of the world's population, still depend on charcoal. Deforestation is a last resort to survive.
In total, 25% of the world's farmland has now been degraded as an inadvertent consequence of our drive to increase food production.
The more a country develops, the more meat its inhabitants consume. Faster and faster, like the life cycle of livestock which may never see a meadow. Manufacturing meat faster than the animal has become a daily routine. In these vast food lots trampled by millions of cattle, not a blade of grass grows. A fleet of trucks from every corner of the country brings in tons of grain, soy meal, and protein-rich granules that will become tons of meat. The result is that it takes 100 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of potatoes, 4,000 liters for 1 kilo of rice, and 13,000 liters for 1 kilo of beef. We have forgotten that resources are scarce. 500 million humans live in the world's desert lands, more than the combined population of Europe. They know the value of water. They know how to use it sparingly. Here, they depend on wells replenished by fossil water. which accumulated underground in the days when it rained on these deserts 25,000 years ago. Fossil water also enables crops to be grown in the desert to provide food for local populations. The field's circular shape derives from the pipes that irrigate them around a central pivot. But there is a heavy price to pay. Fossil water is a non-renewable resource. In Saudi Arabia, the dream of industrial farming in the desert has faded. As if on a parchment map, the light spots on this patchwork show abandoned plots. The irrigation equipment is still there, the energy to pump water also. But the fossil water reserves are severely depleted.
The veins and arteries of our water supply are the lifeblood of our civilization. And the human version of this planetary cycle operates at a global scale. We have altered the planet's water cycle to such an extent that 5 times as much fresh water is stored in reservoirs as flows in all the world's rivers. This is part of the Colorado River system. Along its 2,000-kilometer length, it has over 20 dams. So much water is diverted to the cities and farmland of the American West that most years it no longer reaches the sea. The biggest city it supplies is Los Angeles. Fresh water is delivered across hundreds of kilometers of desert via a network of aqueducts, canals, and pipelines. This system delivers 90% of the city's fresh water. Without it, LA wouldn't exist.
As the river cuts through the Colorado Plateau, its flow is doubled by the Green River, the largest tributary. Below the confluence, I watched the river enter the first of its desert seas, Lake Powell. Today, the lake is shrinking. The West is in its second decade of drought, and everywhere I looked, those 100-foot bathtub rings reminded me of how much water we once had. Below Lake Powell starts the Grand Canyon. Below the Grand Canyon, you reach a dwindling Lake Mead and Hoover Dam. Next to Hoover Dam is Las Vegas. When I was young, I pointed to Vegas like many as the bad boy of the river. When I visited, I found a more complex truth. Las Vegas gets very little water from the Colorado River, so they are forced to use it wisely. The city actually pays people to tear out their front lawns. I saw a house with water-thirsty green grass in the morning turn to desert-friendly shrubs by noon. But not everyone wants to be Vegas. Downstream, the river becomes the border between Arizona and California, and the straws are abundant. I never really knew this part of the river. It is much different than the river I grew up on. It is confined, fractured, and fading. I started seeing the river as an orphan, stretched into a blooming desert, a maze of concrete canals, and a symphony of human thirst.
Faster and faster. In the last 60 years, the Earth's population has almost tripled, and over 2 billion people have moved to the cities.
In 1978, only 18% of Chinese lived in cities. This rose to 30% in 1995 and to nearly 40% in 2002. Now it's just shy of half. But this is still far lower than Europe's urbanization rate of more than 75%, or America's of over 80%. Another 350 million Chinese could move into cities over the next 2 decades. That's the equivalent of more than America's entire population.
China's construction of cities from scratch isn't just about alleviating crowded living conditions. China is obsessed with economic growth, and it's been doing this by funding massive infrastructure projects like this.
Passengers are requested to return to their seats. We are about to land. Please fasten your seatbelts and please refrain from smoking.
People are moving into cities means we do have to build things quite quickly, and again in China they've solved this problem. This 30-story skyscraper was constructed in just 15 days.
Faster and faster. Distances are no longer counted in miles, but in minutes. The automobile shapes new suburbs where every home is a castle, a safe distance from the asphyxiated city centers, and where neat rows of houses huddle around dead-end streets. The model of a lucky few countries has become a universal dream preached by televisions all over the world. Even here in Beijing, it is cloned, copied, and reproduced in these formatted houses that have wiped pagodas off the map.
In the 1920s, light bulbs lasted 2,500 hours. Today, they last only 1,000 hours. What happened? The first nylon stockings on the market were made to last. What happened then?
They time those things. They time them, so when you finally paid for them, they're used up.
Welcome to the Apple Care Service and Support Line.
What is the dirty secret of millions of iPods that landed Apple in court? The answer is a hidden mechanism at the heart of the consumer society.
Planned obsolescence. The desire on the part of a consumer to own something a little newer, a little sooner than is necessary.
Planned obsolescence is not only about deceiving the consumer, it also threatens the planet through a constant stream of toxic waste.
Posterity will never forgive us. Posterity will certainly find out about the throwaway lifestyles of people in the advanced countries.
Conocedor de eso por los análisis que me hicieron, de haber tenido magnesio, bismuto, de haber tenido arsénico, cadmio en mi cuerpo, yo me siento preocupado. Y también me siento preocupado por mis hijos. Y lamentablemente soy de La Oroya, tengo que convivir con estos minerales hasta el día de mi muerte. De retirarme de acá va a ser muy difícil porque no tengo a dónde ir. He nacido acá y aquí me muero con la contaminación y con el aire que respiro.
La Oroya, Peru. The small Peruvian city of La Oroya has seen some of the worst blatant pollutions of the last century. The Missouri-based metal smelting company called Doe Run Corporation has set up in the town since 1922, and as a result of their toxic airborne byproducts, almost all of the children in the town suffer from both respiratory conditions and lead poisoning. 99% of the children tested in La Oroya have blood levels that exceed the acceptable limits of poisoning. Emissions have been decreased by Doe Run since lawsuits have forced more regulations on them, but the toxic materials that have been put out are still actively poisoning the soil in the area.
¿Qué mundo dejamos por nuestros hijos?
Citarum River, Indonesia. The Citarum River runs for more than 186 miles from the Wayang Mountain to the Java Sea in Jakarta, Indonesia. It is one of the main sources of drinking water for the 30 million people who live around it, and is also one of the most polluted rivers in the world. Unregulated factory growth and rapid industrialization have contributed to the dense amount of waste pouring into the Citarum River. 200 textile factories have been built right on the edge of the bank, pouring dyes and industrial chemicals into the river, including lead, arsenic, and mercury. Added to the industrial pollution are civilian contaminants like plastic garbage, used packaging, and just general trash.
In the 70s, this river was a tropical paradise. Now, it's a toxic soup of household rubbish, human feces, and dead animals. Hundreds of textile factories line the riverbanks, supplying high street brands around the world. And although they provide vital employment for locals, lax regulations allow them to spew untreated industrial chemicals into the river unchecked. Indonesia is the second most biodiverse country on the planet, but here in the Citarum River, the catch of the day is trash that can be sold for recycling. "60% of the fish have died out, and it's not just the fish getting sick. People are already suffering with skin diseases and diarrhea, but the potentially horrifying consequences of heavy metal poisoning will take years to make themselves known. A perfect storm of industrialization, lack of infrastructure, and population explosion has overwhelmed the Citarum River.
Avaz, Iran. In 2013, the World Health Organization ranks Avaz, Iran as the place with the highest level of air pollution anywhere. The city is home to 1.3 million residents, but the air nearby is unbreathable. For reference, Iranians in Avaz breathe an air that is 3 times worse than the air in Beijing, which is also pretty notorious for air pollution. This makes it essentially the worst place to breathe anywhere on the planet. Mexico City, Mexico. The air pollution in Mexico City is so heavy that the air above the city is full of contaminants that create a cloud of fog that is visible in satellite imagery. In 1992, the United Nations named Mexico City the most polluted city on the planet. The pollution was thought to cause 1,000 deaths and 35,000 hospitalizations per year. In 2012, the ozone levels in Mexico City were comparable to Los Angeles, but the loosening of regulations in 2015 has led to more and more polluting in the air. Data shows that there may be a direct correlation between increased absenteeism of school children and increased amounts of air pollution in the city. Vapi, India. India is a country that is on the upward climb in terms of industrial development, and while their detrimental effects of development are not as severe as other places in the world, it can still get pretty bad. Like in the Indian town of Vapi, which sits right on the end of 400 kilometers of industrial estates. The people living in Vapi suffer from mercury levels in their water that is 96 times higher than the World Health Organization says is safe, and the heavy metal processing leaves pollutants in the air. Linfen, China. Linfen, China is infamous for its pollution and anecdotally known as the most polluted city in the world. The entire city is blackened and plagued by soot and air pollution that is primarily from unregulated cars coughing up pillars of smog and carbon monoxide. It is also caused by the smoke from burning coals and both legal and illegal mines. The air in Linfen is so polluted that they say hanging laundry out to dry will result in a completely blackened shirt before it even fully dries. It's in the process of currently becoming a cleaner, greener city with pollutant monitoring stations across the cities. However, the pollution in the city is still rampant.
It was only 20 years ago that Linfen was nicknamed the fruit and flower town of Shanxi province. Since then, it's basically been turned into China's coal mine. Linfen produces what any nation of over 1 billion people need, a ton of energy. It's an endless landscape of factories, all spewing a bunch of toxic chemicals into the air and poisoning the land and the water. There's no clouds, just a permanent toxic smog hovering over the city. Linfen is located in the heart of Shanxi province. Every day, thousands of coal trucks go between Linfen and the rest of China's cities. Then they come back empty for more.
Norilsk is the first polluted city in Russia and 7th in the world. So the pollution is due to this industrial, it's metallurgical and mine complex, the biggest in the world on such altitudes. And it pollutes like almost 2 million of tons of sulfur dioxide. One city pollutes like entire France in the year. Pollution affects a lot the health of people, so there are a lot of disease like problems with respiration, some eczema, the rates of cancer are quite elevated in Norilsk.
Chernobyl, Ukraine. Of course, one of the world's most obviously polluted places is Chernobyl, Ukraine. It is the infamous small town in northern Ukraine that suffered from the worst nuclear power plant disaster in history. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant had a major meltdown that poured tons and tons of nuclear waste into the air, forcing the 300,000 people who were living there to be evacuated. Over 20 years after the incident, nearly 4,000 children related to the incident were reported to have thyroid cancer, and there's still a 19-mile radius around the plant that is an active exclusion zone and that no one is allowed to live in. The accident not only had a major effect on the humans who had to live near the plant, but also killed many of the plants and animals nearby. Fish died in huge masses, and the coniferous forest called the red pine forest nearby completely died. Dhaka, Bangladesh. Bangladesh is home to about 170 million people, but is one of the smallest countries in the world in terms of area. The Bangladeshi city of Dhaka suffers majorly from pollution, including a choking amount of air particles, and suffers from a waste management problem that leaves much of the country and city with garbage that just lines the street. The World Health Organization estimates that 15,000 premature deaths are a result of respiratory, pulmonary, and neurological illnesses caused by poor air quality and sanitation.
Today they confirmed contamination high enough to kill workers exposed for a few hours. The discovery of the hotspots is another setback for the plant's owner, TEPCO. It's been struggling to prevent more radiation leaking from the Fukushima site since the March 2011 tsunami that sent these 4 reactors into meltdown. Workers are pumping huge volumes of water into the damaged reactor cores to keep them cool. Even after treatment, the water is highly radioactive and is being stored in these temporary tanks where today's contamination was confirmed. How far it could have spread is anyone's guess. On August 20th, TEPCO confirmed at least 300 tonnes of radioactive water had leaked out of temporary tanks into groundwater below the site. It's also emerged the reactor buildings themselves are leaking contaminated water. It's thought at least some of that radioactive groundwater is flowing straight out into the sea.
Years before that plant site is cleaned up. The damage that has been experienced at Fukushima is so great and so extensive that I don't think any one utility, certainly TEPCO, has the capability to be able to pay for all of that. So it becomes a national issue.
Internationally, some experts are calling for a task force to intervene and assist Japan with a nuclear mess which will take decades to clean up.
Faster and faster. The more the world develops, the greater its thirst for energy. Everywhere, machines dig, bore, and rip from the earth the pieces of stars buried in its depths since its creation. Minerals.
We can slice the tops of mountains and dig holes big enough to bury a city. In a single year, we now move more earth and rock than all the natural processes of erosion put together. Our machines have transformed the planet.
Dubai is a sort of culmination of the Western model, a country where the impossible becomes possible, building artificial islands in the sea, for example. Dubai has few natural resources, but with the money from oil, it can bring millions of tons of material and workers from all over the planet. Dubai has no farmland, but it can import food. Dubai has no water, but it can afford to expend immense amounts of energy to desalinate seawater and build the highest skyscrapers in the world. Dubai has endless sun, but no solar panels.
History tells us that we don't tend to run out of resources. Instead, when push comes to shove, we find new ones. But that is a lesson from human history. The planet's history is perhaps a more important lesson for us.
It's a lesson about the most dramatic human influence on the planet. The speed and scale at which we're changing the atmosphere. Levels of carbon dioxide and methane are higher than at any time in the last 15 million years. We can already see some of the effects. The thickness of Arctic sea ice has almost halved. Some of the extra carbon dioxide we've pumped into the atmosphere has been absorbed by the oceans. This has increased their acidity by 30%, hindering the growth of marine creatures like corals. Over the last few decades, the frequency of extreme hurricanes has doubled in some areas. We're at the beginning of a dramatic period of change. At the heart of it is the greenhouse effect, a global warming caused by the gases we release.
Human activities like deforestation and the burning of fossil fuels, like coal, oil, and gas, are changing our climate in ways that pose increasing threats to human well-being in both developing and industrialized nations.
Around the world, agricultural practices have developed as a function of topography, soil type, crop type, annual rainfall, and tradition. In Minnesota, US, the very regular grid pattern reflects early 19th century surveying. The size of the fields is a function of mechanization, and that dictates a certain efficiency. In Kansas, US, center pivot irrigation is responsible for the field pattern. In northwest Germany, the small size and random pattern of fields is a leftover from the Middle Ages. Near Santa Cruz, Bolivia, the pie or radio-patterned fields are part of a settlement scheme. At the center of each unit is a small community. Outside of Bangkok, Thailand, rice paddies fed by an extensive network of canals that is hundreds of years old appear as small skinny rectangular fields. And in the Cerrado in southern Brazil, cheap cost of land and its flatness have resulted in enormous farms and large field sizes.
Ancient forests maintain the balance of life on Earth. They house around 2/3 of the world's land-based species of plants and animals. The remaining tracts of forests influence day-to-day weather, but also help to keep the climate stable over time. Tropical forests cover only 7% of the world's land surface, but they store vast amounts of carbon. Logging and burning releases that carbon into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change. Tropical deforestation accounts for an astounding 20% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than all of the aeroplanes, cars and trains put together. And deforestation of the Amazon has turned Brazil into the world's 4th largest climate polluter.
In barely 40 years, the world's largest rainforest, the Amazon, has been reduced by 20%. The forest gives way to cattle ranches or soybean farms. 95% of these soybeans are used to feed livestock and poultry in Europe and Asia. And so, a forest is turned into meat. Barely 20 years ago, Borneo, the 4th largest island in the world, was covered by a vast primary forest. At the current rate of deforestation, it will have totally disappeared within 10 years. Borneo, what was one of the Earth's greatest reservoirs of biodiversity. This catastrophe was provoked by the decision to produce palm oil, one of the most productive and consumed oils in the world, on Borneo. Palm oil not only caters to our growing demand for food, but also cosmetics, detergents, and increasingly, alternative fuels. The forest diversity was replaced by a single species, the oil palm. For local people, it provides employment. It is an agricultural industry. Another example of massive deforestation is the eucalyptus. Eucalyptus is used to make paper pulp. Plantations are growing as demand for paper has increased 5-fold in 50 years. One forest does not replace another forest. At the foot of these eucalyptus trees, nothing grows because their leaves form a bed that is toxic for most other plants. They grow quickly, but exhaust water reserves. Soybeans, palm oil, eucalyptus trees. Deforestation destroys the essential to produce the superfluous. Our oil tankers are getting bigger and bigger. Our energy requirements are constantly increasing. We try to power growth like a bottomless oven that demands more and more fuel. We're not changing our model. Oil might run out. We can still extract oil from the tar sands of Canada. The biggest trucks in the world move thousands of tons of sand. The process of heating and separating bitumen from the sand requires millions of cubic meters of water. Colossal amounts of energy are needed. The pollution is catastrophic. Nigeria is the biggest oil exporter in Africa, and yet 70% of the population lives under the poverty line. The wealth is there, but the country's inhabitants don't have access to it. The same is true all over the globe. Half the world's poor live in resource-rich countries. Our mode of development has not fulfilled its promises. In 50 years, the gap between rich and poor has grown wider than ever. Today, half the world's wealth is in the hands of the richest 2% of the population. Can such disparities be maintained? They're the cause of population movements whose scale we have yet to fully realize. The city of Lagos had a population of 700,000 in 1960. That will rise to 16 million by 2025. Lagos is one of the fastest growing megalopolises in the world. The new arrivals are mostly farmers forced off the land for economic or demographic reasons, or because of diminishing resources. This is a radically new type of urban growth driven by the urge to survive rather than to prosper. All over the planet, the poorest scrabble to survive on scraps, while we continue to dig for resources that we can no longer live without.
Now, most of the remaining oil on Earth lies underground in less industrially developed countries. In order to get that oil, and to get it as cheaply as possible, Western companies have devastated environments and caused terrible human suffering. People in Western societies are largely unaware of the harm caused from oil extraction. We are unaware because it goes unreported. And as oil becomes scarce and prices rise, the environmental destruction and human suffering will likely increase. And the competition for oil will get more aggressive.
One of the most common questions that people ask is, do you think that the peak oil that you read about is going to produce a global catastrophe? And my answer is, it already has. There are people dying right now as we're speaking. There are people dying right now over oil. There are governments being twisted and changed and seized over oil. The climate is changing because of oil. And there's a small group of very, very wealthy people who are getting richer and richer because of oil.
We are moving from cheap, abundant oil to expensive, scarce oil. And we absolutely are, with technology, without technology, where the peak is not. And that change is a major change in the industrial history of the world, and that change is going to be huge. Is there possibility of conflict? Absolutely. I think the danger is not only between large powers that are consumers of oil. I think the danger is that there will be more invasions to secure oil. And I also think that there is an increasing, huge danger of civil conflict and civil war inside oil exporters themselves.
In a single lifetime, we have grown into a phenomenal global force. We move more sediment and rock annually than all natural processes, such as erosion and rivers. We manage 3/4 of all land outside the ice sheets. Greenhouse gas levels this high have not been seen for over 1 million years. Temperatures are increasing. We have made a hole in the ozone layer. We are losing biodiversity. Many of the world's deltas are sinking due to damming, mining, and other causes. Sea level is rising. Ocean acidification is a real threat. We are altering Earth's natural cycles. We have entered the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch dominated by humanity. This relentless pressure on our planet risks unprecedented destabilization. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
The relationship between us and the planet is changing. We're no longer at its mercy. We have now become a major planetary force.
The fundamental elements of our planet have helped shape human history. But now, we ourselves are a force of nature to be reckoned with. Even in the wildest corners of the Earth, you can't escape our human influence. The question is, what does that mean for our future?
This is Kevin Carter's Pulitzer Prize-winning photo taken in 1994 during the Sudan famine. The picture depicts a famine-stricken child being stalked by a vulture. The child is crawling towards a United Nations food camp, located a kilometer away. No one knows what happened to the child, including the photographer who left the scene as the photo was taken. He later confided to friends that he wished he had intervened. Journalists were warned never to touch famine victims for fear of disease. 3 months later, and only weeks after bestowed with the Pulitzer Prize, Kevin Carter committed suicide.
The dictator of Tomania, the conqueror of Austerlitz, the future emperor of the world. Speak. I can't. You must. It's our only hope.
I'm sorry. I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful. But we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent, and all will be lost. The aeroplane and the radio have brought us closer together. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men, cries out for universal brotherhood, for the unity of us all. Even now, my voice is reaching millions throughout the world. Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people. To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish. Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes, men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men. You have the love of humanity in your hearts. You don't hate, only the unloved hate, the unloved and the unnatural. Soldiers, don't fight for slavery, fight for liberty. In the 17th chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you. You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world, a decent world, that will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world, to do away with national barriers, to do away with greed, with hate and intolerance. Let us fight for a world of reason, a world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!